to hear three different stories today, and they're from three different countries. The first one is from a country called Yemen.
Yemen.
Once upon a time, there was a little girl called Wasila. Not particularly beautiful, not particularly intelligent. There was nothing special about her. Wasila had a favorite toy, a little rag doll.
Ragdoll.
Not particularly expensive, not particularly well made. There was nothing terribly special about this rag doll. One day, while Wasila was playing outside in the streets with her little rag doll, a crow swooped down from the sky, landed in front of her, and said, "Caw, caw! Ya Wasila, ya Wasila, ma lana bil yadi hila. This is your fate. Do not berate." And with that, the crow hopped forward, opened its beak, grabbed the rag doll, grew a size bigger, and it flew away. And Wasila watched this crow fly, 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 fly away until it turned into a dot in the sky and disappeared. Well, that night, when Wasila went home, her mother asked her where her little rag doll was. Because you see, Wasila didn't come from a wealthy family. They had very little. And so whatever they did have, they wanted to keep. And when Wasila couldn't explain to her mother what had happened to the rag doll, I mean, how do you tell your mother that a crow came down from the sky and talked to you and then it flew away and disappeared? And how do you explain that? Well, she said nothing. And so her mother, quite upset with her, sent her off to her room. But the years went by and Wasila grew and grew. And she was doing well at school. Not particularly well, not particularly badly. There was nothing terribly special about how well she was doing at school. One day, she was walking back home with her results card in her hand, quite proud. And as she was walking in the street, the same crow swooped down from the sky, landed in front of her, and said, "Caw, caw! Ya Wasila, ya Wasila, ma lana bil yadi hila. This is your fate. Do not berate." And with that, the crow hopped forward, opened its beak, snatched her results card, grew even bigger, and it flew away. And Wasila watched the crow fly, fly, fly away until it turned into a dot in the sky and disappeared. Well, when Wasila went back to school the next day without her results card and without her parents' signature on it, she got into a lot of trouble, and it wasn't forgotten for many years. But the years went by, and Wasila grew and grew, and it was time for her to marry her sweetheart. And on the day of her wedding day, her parents brought out all the money that they had, because remember, they didn't have a lot. So they reached under the mattresses and into their clothes and under their turbans and they gave her all the money that they had so that she could go and buy the biggest lamb she could find. Well, the reason they did that, you see, is because it was the custom that the bride's family would hold a dinner in the honor of the groom's family. That was just the custom. So Wasila went off to the butcher and she gave him all of the money she had, and she bought the largest lamb she could find to take back home. And then she put that lamb on her shoulder and she started her way back. And as she was walking, well, none other but the same crow swooped down from the sky, landed in front of her, and said, "Caw, caw! Ya Wasila, ya Wasila, ma lana bil yadi hila. This is your fate. Do not berate. And with that, the crow hopped forward, opened its beak, snatched the lamb, now growing ridiculously large for a crow, and it flew away. And Wasila watched this crow as it flew away and turned into a dot in the sky and disappeared. Well, when Wasila arrived home, without the lamb and without the money, her parents were tongue-tied. And when the groom's family arrived and saw that there was no feast being held in their honor, well, they were offended, and the wedding was cancelled. Now, Wasila just didn't want to stay in that village anymore. She just felt too bad, too awful. She wanted to leave. She wanted to see what else the world had to offer, whether the rest of the world was a little bit kinder, a little bit gentler, a little bit sweeter, whether it could understand her a little bit better. And so she decided to leave. And she said goodbye to her parents and reluctantly started her journey. Now, she was dressed as a man. Because you see, in those days, it wasn't so safe to travel on your own as a woman. And Wasila thought that that was really not fair. Why couldn't she just travel around on her own as a woman? But that's the way the world was. And so dressed as a man, she started walking to find her fate of elsewhere. And she walked and she walked and she walked and she walked until the soles of her feet started to burn from the sand beneath them, and her sandals started to fray at the edges, and she had to shield her eyes from the sun. She walked for days until she came across a city so beautiful, so majestic, a figment of her imagination. Tall minarets and mango trees and beautiful houses. And there, Wasila set up a business, trading salt. Because can you imagine what your food would be like without salt? Probably a little bit bland. Well, you see, the people of this city had never tried salt before. And what Wasila brought them, dressed as she was as a businessman, was quite special. Now, who heard of this businessman, who was Wasila, but the Sultan of the city himself? Now, the Sultan wanted to make the acquaintance of this businessman, so he invited him round for dinner. And that night, as the businessman arrived to the palace of the Sultan, well, the Sultan looked at this businessman, this skin like dark honey, these eyes like black pearls, and he thought, how handsome. That night, the Sultan and the businessman, well, they ate and they laughed and they drank and they talked and they talked and they drank and they ate and they laughed and they laughed and they ate and they drank. Until the Sultan, in the early hours of the morning, insisted that the businessman start living with him in his guest quarters, in his palace. His palace was huge, you see. And the businessman, who was Wasila, agreed. And from that day on, they became the best of companions. They hunted together, they read poetry together, they ate together, they feasted together, they drank together, they did everything together. They became so close. And one day, because the Sultan was so excited to see his friend, he barged into the guest house without knocking on the door, and he saw the businessman, who is Wasila, stark naked. Well, that was okay, because the Sultan decided, well, all right, this can work out quite well. And he proposed to Wasila, and Wasila said yes, and they got married. And soon enough, they had a little baby girl. Not particularly cute, not particularly precocious. There was nothing terribly special about this baby girl, except that she was their flesh and their blood, their morsel of meaning in the world. And one day, Wasila was sitting outside in the palace gardens with her little baby girl when suddenly the crow swooped down from the sky, landed in front of her, and said, "Caw, caw, ya Wasila, ya Wasila, ma lana bil yadi hila." This is your fate. Do not berate. And with that, the crow hopped forward, opened its beak. "La'a," said Wasila. And the crow looked at Wasila, and it shrank a little. "La'a!" And the crow shrank a little more. "La'a!" And the crow shrank so quickly it turned into a dot, and it disappeared, never to be seen again. And from that day on, Wasila lived well, she just lived. Not particularly happily, not particularly sadly. There was nothing terribly special about her life, except that she had found her voice.